Thank you, Mr. Ackerman, for agreeing to this interview. I want to start by asking you about the idea behind the book, because you, as an ex-Marine, you served 5 tours in Afghanistan and Iraq. So why did you want to write a story about a potential war, a global conflict between China and the U.S.?
Well, thanks for having me on the show, first of all. You know, the idea for this book originally was my co-author's, Admiral Stavridis, and he came to our editor at Penguin Press with this idea of writing a work of speculative fiction that would imagine what it looked like if the U.S. and China went to war. So when he came to our editor, he laid out the idea, and our editor said, "Well, this sounds great, but you know, you're not a novelist, and shouldn't you work? I think you should work with one. And aren't you and Elliot friends?" And so they sort of came to me with the idea, and it was intriguing to me because, you know, I remember during the Cold War with the Soviet Union that there was this very rich body of literature and also film that imagined what a Third World War would look like, the U.S. versus the Soviets. And really, you know, if you think about the relationship between the United States and China, you could certainly say that if we're not in a Cold War, we're certainly in the foothills of a Cold War. And there's really been very little written about that from a speculative standpoint. And so the idea for us was, you know, let's try to tell this story. You know, it's not a work of predictive fiction, it's a work of speculative fiction. So we're speculating, what would this conflict look like? And so to me, that seemed like you know, a worthwhile project with you know, a co-author who I'd known for many years and respected.
Right. And the story starts with a U.S. Navy conducting a freedom of navigation patrol in the South China Sea, and it's something in your story supported by the U.S. president, who is the first one without any party affiliation. I'm interested in why you put, or why you and your co-author put that detail into the story.
Certainly. So so as you mentioned, the U.S. president is a female, which I don't think surprises anyone. I'd be shocked if by the year 2034 the United States hadn't had a woman president. But I think what might be more surprising to readers is that she is the first president since George Washington to be elected without a political party. She's neither a Republican nor a Democrat. She's an independent. And I think that is a projection outward of how dysfunctional our 2 political parties have become in the United States. And if you look at the demographics of the country today, the plurality of Americans are not Republicans or Democrats. The plurality are political independents. And so increasingly, as our lives become atomized, it would follow that only having 2 political parties might not work anymore. And so we projected that forward and tried to imagine what it would look like if you had an independent running the country during this crisis.
And even without party affiliation, she still supports the freedom of navigation.
She does. And one of the things that we mention is that, and you can see this in recent times, that as divisive as many domestic issues are with the American population, that typically foreign policy is an area, at least recently, where both parties have operated, you know, generally in lockstep. For instance, we're even seeing this today with what's going on in Afghanistan, in which President Biden is basically carrying out what was President Trump's policy.
Right. And as ex-military, do you think that the freedom of navigation works in terms of containing China's aggressiveness or its a potential expansion of its sovereignties in seas? Or what do you think?
I think the South China Sea is a vast body of water that is half the size of the continental United States. And so, you know, China's claims that it is territorial waters have been found to have no legitimacy in every international court in the world. So I think the freedom of navigation patrols that are not only conducted by the United States, but are also conducted by numerous other nations, just go ahead and are asserting the international community's stance that this claim is not a valid claim.
So do you think that this is going to work, or do you think that it is working as it is intended, the freedom of navigation?
I think right now it's working as is intended, but I think, you know, certainly depending on the decisions made by the Chinese government and whether or not they decide to become more aggressive you could have a scenario where there would be a confrontation like the one we imagine in the South China Sea. And I think what should concern everyone, Americans and Chinese alike, would be if that confrontation would precipitate a larger conflict.
And when one Chinese official in your story, I believe he said that China sank a flotilla of U.S. ships not to start a war, but to send out a warning. It's not something that I think the current Chinese government is likely to do, this degree of aggressiveness. So why did you put it? Why did you write it that way?
I think if we look, the history of warfare is one of miscalculation by all parties and misinterpretation of one another's actions. So I think that a gesture that one side might think is a very gradual and incremental assertion of its rights could be misinterpreted by another party, and even that gesture itself might not occur exactly according to plan on the ground. And then you wind up entering into one of these cycles of escalation where one side then reacts to the other, and with each cycle, the conflict just begins to spiral further and further out of control.
And in your story, China's cyber attack reached the White House computers. That sounds just crazy. Do you think that in 15 years, I know the story is not meant to be a prediction, but more like a speculation. But do you think in 15 years, China will possess that kind of threat?
I think that right now, as much as during the Cold War, we had a very clear understanding of what it meant to be able to, have mutually assured destruction. We have that capability today. However, it not only exists in the nuclear field, it also exists in the realm of cyber. And so I'd have two words for you: solar winds, the cyber attack unleashed by the Russians that occurred earlier this year, in which 400 of the Fortune 500 companies were hacked. And it's a hack so vast, we're still trying to understand its true scope. So, cyber warfare, which in many respects is an invisible battlefield, is one where not only the United States, China, Russia, all parties have vulnerabilities, and the scope of devastation is vast, but it's also much more difficult for most people to visualize because it doesn't come with a Hiroshima or a Nagasaki type mushroom cloud. It's far more insidious and tough to imagine sometimes.
And even though the story is about the confrontation between China and the U.S., by the end of the story, India was the one that was taking advantage of both countries. I just want to know why that was part of the plot. Is it because that you and your co-author think that India is likely to rise to a leading world power, or that's just something you put there to show that someone else might become the eventual winner when U.S. and China at war with each other?
Well, I think India is a very interesting and player on the world scene, one that's often not given its due. Its demographics are young and expanding. It occupies obviously a critical geographic place on the globe. So, we can debate whether or not India would be in a position to rise that rapidly in the year 2034. But India, as we move forward into the 21st century, is certainly going to be a player. But I think, one of the larger themes we're engaging at when we show sort of the rise of India, without spoiling too much from the book, is this idea of what happens when an established power is challenged by a rising power in a conflict. And I think, we've seen that. It's called, oftentimes people refer to it as the Thucydides trap, going back to the Peloponnesian Wars, in which the established power, Athens, was challenged by Sparta, a rising power. Or more recently, we can look at the First and Second World Wars in the 20th century, in which an established power, Britain, was challenged by a rising power, Germany. So that's very much the framework of the book. But if we look back at the last 100 years, which I think in many ways we could characterize as having been an American century, it's an American century that was birthed out of two European conflagrations, the First and the Second World War. And those were wars that the United States did not start, but the United States certainly finished. And so in the novel 2034, we have a war that's started by the United States and China. And it's a war that neither party really wins. The person who wins it is the party who finishes it, which, as you'll see if you read the book, is India.
Right. And this leads to my next question, because one character in the story said that America used to finish wars like the World War II and not start wars. And with what we're seeing in Afghanistan, with the withdrawal going on, and some have compared the U.S. withdrawal there to the one in Saigon back in Vietnam War. So how do you see this kind of comparison?
I think there's some comparisons that one can make. I would argue that, in fact, the war in Afghanistan was, unlike the war in Iraq, was not a war that the United States started. You know, that war began on September 11th. And I remember, I was old enough to really remember those events. And it was obvious that merited some type of a U.S. response. I think the challenge in Afghanistan was that our response got detoured and elongated and went in directions it strategically never should have gone into. But unfortunately, the United States has, in recent years, shown a propensity to start wars in ways it didn't used to do. And there are wars that we seem incapable of finishing. And that has become a problem for our foreign policy and our stature around the globe.
Do you think the U.S. is getting worse at finishing wars?
Well, I think we've certainly, our track record for winning wars decisively, at least in the last 20 years, has not been strong.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Then I want to ask you, what would China's interest be in Afghanistan? Because recently we're seeing a lot of Chinese officials getting real close to the Taliban, which is weird if you consider how anti-terrorism, at least on paper, that the Chinese government is. So why do you think that China is doing this at this moment?
I think because it's good politics for the Chinese government. There are vast mineral resources in Afghanistan that, if they can be tapped into, would be an economic boon for the Chinese government. I think it's also realpolitik that Afghanistan sits at a crucial intersection in Asia, and it's important for China and for others to have a toehold in the region, to have diplomatic relations with the Afghans. And I think internationally too, it's also a way to to stick a finger in the eye of the Western world, particularly given how calamitous recent events have been in Afghanistan.
And your story, the novel, has the invasion of Taiwan by China in it. First of all, how likely do you see this happening in the near future?
I think the question of Taiwan is an open question, and is one that is going to play significantly in the next, certainly 5 to 10 years. I think the question becomes, what would it look like if China tried to move on Taiwan? Would it look like a, Second World War amphibious assault on the shores of Taiwan? Or, would it look something more akin to what we've seen with China clamping down on Hong Kong, something that's more gradual, something that never reaches a level that demands true international intervention until the international community wakes up and realizes that China's influence over Taiwan has grown so significantly that Taiwan is about to be imminently absorbed by China. So I think it is certainly a question that is going to feature in significant ways in the next 10 years.
And going back to the Afghanistan question that we just talked about, if you look at what's happening, some people, they look at what's happening in Afghanistan, the intervention sort of failed, or at least this is not the ideal outcome of the 20-year war. And they look at this and then look at Taiwan and they'd be like, well, I guess China has a lot less to worry about invading Taiwan, because if this is the best that the US can do when it comes to intervention, then I guess China can just do it and maybe get away with it. So what do you think?
Well, I think if China tried a classic conventional invasion of Taiwan and the US decided to intervene, it would be a very costly and bloody war on both sides, because those are two very different styles of war fighting. A long 20-year counterinsurgency campaign in Afghanistan is something very different than a sharp, clearly defined intervention in Taiwan by the United States, where you have one conventional power against another conventional power. And if you look at the United States track record in conventional warfare, it's pretty strong. So I certainly pray that is a conflict that both China and the United States have the wisdom to avoid.
And one of the characters in your story, Lingbao, he's a Chinese military official. He is half American, half Chinese. I'm just curious as to why you set up the character that way.
I think there are a number of characters who sort of have these identities that in backgrounds they're in people who straddle two worlds. I think, I'm a novelist, and I think that makes the characters more interesting because they can understand the duality both within themselves, but also the duality of the situation and the argument on both sides. And so the thing that drives story is conflict, and particularly conflict within an individual, and having someone with that type of a background and an identity, whether it's Lingbao or Dr. Sandeep Chowdhury, who works on the National Security Staff. I wanted those types of characters where you as the reader would understand their inner conflicts as well.
Right. I was just going to talk about Sandeep Chowdhury. He is a son of Indian immigrant who works for the U.S. president, and there's this very interesting scene where he talks to his uncle, who is a former Indian admiral, and he said that where else in the world can a son of immigrants rise up to work in the White House? And his uncle said, well, America is not so special. So many believe that immigrants have made and will keep America great. But also in recent years, we've seen a very strong anti-immigrant sentiment in the US, and many around the world in the past few years may not be looking at the US the same way they did decades ago, or at least in the past century. How do you look at this reality? What do you think?
Well, I think the reality right now is, listen, if you go, and I travel around, and when I was in the Marines, I saw this firsthand too, that to this day, if you go to countries and you go to the Chinese embassy, or let's say the Russian embassy, you don't see lines out the door for people requesting visas to immigrate to those countries. You do still see that around the world at the American embassy. One of the things that makes the United States unique as a nation is we are not a nation of blood and soil. Anyone can come to this country, become a citizen, and they are American. I cannot immigrate to China, become a citizen, and become Chinese. It doesn't work that way. So what makes the United States unique is we're not a nation of blood and soil. We're a nation generally founded around certain ideals that oftentimes we live up to imperfectly, but those ideals exist nevertheless. And, in the book, particularly a character like Chowdhury and the conversation you're ever seeing with his uncle is sort of making the point to him that these ideals you so value, I value too, but I see them as not being necessarily uniquely American. They can exist in other places too. And if they cease to exist in America, those ideals will probably go on and live somewhere else. But the ideal remains. And those ideals, I would say, are classic liberal Enlightenment ideals that the United States, again, despite its flaws, still strives to live up to today. And I mean, ultimately for me, that's what the country's about.